For most of your life, the sun was the whole story. Find the sunniest patch, and that was where the garden went. So when the time comes to trade the big yard for a balcony, a patio, a little corner of a building that never sees a straight hour of sun, it can feel like the gardening years are quietly closing behind you. I want to tell you something, friend to friend. They're not. That shaded corner is not the end of your garden. And the reason these vegetables actually do well there has almost nothing to do with the light. It has everything to do with something happening a few inches below the rim of the pot, something the seed catalogs never quite got around to mentioning. Stay with me, because near the end I'll show you the one free trick that nearly doubles the light in a dark corner without spending a cent, and the single watering habit that quietly drowns more shade gardens than anything else. If you've ever knelt down by a tired-looking plant in a dim spot and wondered whether you'd lost your touch, let me put that worry down for you right now. You haven't. You've grown more food than most folks ever will. This was never about your hands. It was about being handed the wrong list of plants. Here's the honest truth, and it's good news. There is no such thing as a vegetable that needs the dark. But there is a whole pantry of vegetables that don't need the blazing sun to give you the best they've got. And a handful of them are genuinely happier out of it. The catalogs sell you the sun worshippers, the big beefsteak tomatoes, the peppers, the melons that sprawl across a quarter acre. Those are the photos on the front of the packet. What got left off the packet is almost everything else. The greens, the roots, the herbs that have fed families for generations, in the cool shade of a porch or a north-facing wall. The folks at the University of California's Master Gardener program put it plainly. With as little as 3 hours of sun, you can grow leafy greens. With 4, you can grow roots. They'll be a touch smaller, the leaves a little thinner, but they'll be tender and sweet and yours. And here's the part nobody says out loud. In some ways, a shaded spot is easier than full sun. You water less often, and the crops that bolt and turn bitter the moment summer arrives will keep going far longer for you, simply because they're out of the heat. So, before we ever talk about which plant goes where, let me hand you the thing the garden industry has no reason to tell you. The secret was never the light, it's the soil. Think about it. There's a reason the garden center steers you toward grow lights, heat mats, and shelving units the minute you mention a shady balcony. Those things have a barcode. Knowing which plant already wants your corner and feeding the few inches of soil it sits in does not. You can't patent a fact, you can't sell good soil back to a gardener every single spring, so nobody runs an ad for it. It simply slipped out of the conversation. And in the shade, the soil matters more than ever, because shaded soil stays damp far longer than soil baking in the sun. That is the gift. It's also the trap, and we'll come back to it. Dr. Linda Chalker-Scott, the urban horticulturist at Washington State University, who has spent years separating real garden science from the folklore, is wonderful on this. She'll tell you that an ideal soil is only about 5% organic matter, and that the simplest, cheapest way to keep feeding it is a layer of mulch right on top. Compost in the pot, a little mulch over it, and the soil does the rest. She'll also gently bust one of the oldest container myths there is. That handful of gravel everyone tells you to throw in the bottom of the pot for drainage, it doesn't help. It can actually make things worse, holding a soggy layer right where your roots don't want it. Skip the gravel. Use good potting soil all the way down, and a pot with a hole in the bottom. That's the whole trick. Feed the soil, and the soil feeds the plant. Even in the shade. Especially in the shade. Now, let's fill that corner. We'll start with the easiest wins of all. The salad bowl right outside your door. First up is loose leaf lettuce. If there's a poster child for low light growing, this is it. The trick is to skip the heading types like iceberg. Those want more sun and more time than a shady corner gives. Reach instead for the loose leaf kinds, the ones you pick a leaf at a time. In a cool, shaded spot, the soil stays cool. And that keeps the lettuce sweet and tender, instead of turning bitter and shooting up to seed the way it does in the heat. A pot just 6 inches deep will do. And you don't harvest the whole head. You take the outer leaves, and it keeps giving you more. A few leaves for tonight's supper, and it's ready again in a few days. Right alongside it, plant spinach. Now, you've probably grown spinach in spring, only to watch it bolt and turn bitter the second the summer sun hit it. That's not a failing. That's just spinach doing what heat and long days tell it to do. In a shaded container, the soil stays cool, and that acts like a gentle pause button. Your spinach stays sweet and tender and keeps handing you outer leaves for the kitchen weeks longer than it ever would out in the open. Third is arugula, that peppery green for a gourmet salad. The bite comes from natural compounds in the leaf, and here's the thing. Out in the blazing sun, the plant cranks those compounds up, and the leaves turn harsh and tough, then bolt. Tuck arugula into the shade and you calm all that down. The leaves stay tender and balanced, and you get to harvest for a good long while before it ever thinks about flowering. Sow a few seeds every couple of weeks, and you'll never be without it. And to round out the salad bowl, Swiss chard. Chard is one of the most forgiving, good-natured plants you can grow. In the shade, it gives you leaves that stay tender and mild all season, instead of going leathery in the heat. Now, I'll be honest with you about one thing, because honest is how we do it here. Those jewel-bright stems, the ruby reds and golden yellows, they actually deepen with more sun, not less. So in your cool corner, you're not growing chard for a fireworks show, you're growing it for something better. Leaves that stay sweet and soft, picked from the outside, week after week. Give it a pot 8 to 10 inches deep, and it'll keep you in greens for months. That's the first group. 4 plants, and not one of them needs more than a few hours of soft light. Now let's step up to the greens you cook down, the hardy, old-fashioned ones that have been simmering on stoves in this country for as long as there have been gardens. Number 5 is kale, and kale practically laughs at the shade. The dinosaur kind, the curly kind, take your pick. A little shade actually mellows its flavor and stretches the harvest out. It grows a touch slower, yes, but the leaves come in more tender because the plant isn't toughening itself up against the sun. Don't wait for one big head. That's cabbage, and that's a different story. With kale, you just keep picking the outer leaves and leave the center to carry on. Number 6 is one close to a lot of hearts, especially down south: collard greens. Collards are built much like kale, hardy, patient, happiest when it's cool, and perfectly willing to grow in a shaded spot. The flavor even sweetens after a cool spell. Pick the lowest leaves first and work your way up the stalk, and a few plants will feed you for a long, long season. Number 7. Mustard greens. These bring a peppery warmth to a plate, and like the others, they bolt fast and turn sharp when summer bears down. Shade slows that rush to seed and keeps the leaves milder and more tender. They tuck happily into a shallow planter, and you can start snipping while they're still young. And number 8 rounds out the cooking greens: bok choy. This crisp little Asian green treats a shaded balcony like a luxury suite. Out in a hot, sunny spot, the soil in a pot cooks, and bok choy panics. It sends up a flower stalk, turns woody, goes bitter. But under the cool cover of shade, the stalks stay thick, juicy, and crisp. Its roots are shallow, so a planter 6 to 8 inches deep is plenty. North-facing balcony? This is your plant. Now, before we go any further, everything we've covered so far, and everything still to come, I've gathered onto a single page. The plants, how much light each one really needs, the pot depths, the honest year-one expectations. One page you can tape inside a cabinet door or carry to the garden center. Point your phone at the code on the screen and it's yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for. Then come right back, because this next group might be the most useful thing on the whole balcony. The ones that give you a reason to step outside every single morning. These are the herbs and the green onions, the living windowsill. There's a particular comfort in these. Something to step outside and tend with your morning coffee. A few leaves to snip for supper that evening. A small, living reason to open the door each day. Number 9 is parsley, and parsley is one of the great unsung shade plants. It puts up with all kinds of conditions. It's pretty enough to edge a planter, and on the cooler, shadier side of a building, it keeps going well into the fall. Plant it once, and a good clump will serve you across more than one season. Snip the outer stems as you need them. Number 10 is cilantro, and oh, cilantro can break your heart in the sun. You buy a healthy little plant, set it on a bright sill, and within 2 weeks it shoots up, flowers, and quits on you. That's bolting, and heat and strong sun are what trigger it. Put cilantro in the shade, and you slow that clock right down. The plant settles in and keeps making the leaves you actually want. Sow a fresh pinch every few weeks, and you'll have it on hand all season. Number 11 is mint, and here's one that truly prefers the shade. No honest labeling needed. Mint loves a cool, moist corner, and in the shade, the soil holds its moisture, which is exactly what mint is after. One word of warning, the kind you'd give a friend. Mint is a bully. Those running roots will choke out everything around them. So always, always give mint its own pot. On its own, in the shade, it will hand you fragrant leaves for years. Number 12. Chives and garlic chives. If you love that gentle onion or garlic note, but don't have the sun for full onions, this is your answer. Chives pour their energy into their slender leaves instead of building a bulb underground, so they get by on far less light than you'd think. They'll tolerate light shade just fine. I'll be straight with you. They may flower a little less than they would in full sun, but the leaves keep coming, tender and mild. Snip what you need with scissors, and the same clump returns every year. And number 13, green onions, scallions. Purdue's extension says it simply. Onions are somewhat tolerant of shade. And the lovely thing is, we're not asking these for a fat bulb. We just want the green tops. So a few hours of soft light is plenty, and a little shade even holds off bolting in the heat. Best of all, and this is as close to free as gardening gets, save the white root ends from the scallions you buy at the store, set them in a pot, and they'll grow you a whole new crop. Snip the greens, leave the roots, and they sprout right back. That's the windowsill that feeds you a little something every morning. Now let's do something the catalogs swear you can't do in the shade. Let's grow roots. Number 14, and this one is your quick win. Radishes. Radishes are about the fastest thing you can grow, ready in a matter of weeks, which makes them deeply satisfying when you're just getting a corner going. If your confidence took a knock from some plant that sulked in a dark spot, let radishes be the ones that hand it back to you. Now radishes do technically like the sun, so give them the brightest few hours your corner offers. But too much heat makes them woody and fiercely hot, and sends them to seed. A cooler, part-shaded spot keeps them mild, crisp, and crunchy. They'll be on the smaller side, but small, sweet, and crisp beats big and pithy any day. Sow a few every couple of weeks for a steady, gentle harvest. Number 15. Beets. And beets are really two crops in one. Down below you get tender baby beets, and up top you get a steady supply of beet greens that are every bit as good in the kitchen. I'll be honest, the way we always are. In the shade you will not get those big, fist-sized roots you'd pull from a sunny bed. But you'll get sweet little roots in all those greens, from a dark corner that was supposedly good for nothing. That's a fair trade in my book. Number 16. Carrots. Carrots appreciate a break from the baking sun too. The heat turns them starchy and can crack them. A cool, part-shaded pot keeps them crisp and sweet. The honest note here is simple. With less light, they grow slower and stay smaller. So do yourself a favor and choose the short, round, or half-long kinds, the little Paris market types and the half-longs that were practically made for a pot. Skip the long varieties that want a deep, sunny trench. Pick the right shape, and you'll be pulling sweet little carrots from the shade all the same. Now, two more. The rule breakers. Crops that aren't supposed to work in the shade at all, but quietly do. Number 17 is bush beans. Now I'll level with you, because that's the whole point of this channel. Beans are a fruiting crop, which means they're the hungriest for sun on our entire list. Give them the brightest 4 or 5 hours you've got. You won't get a bumper crop in the shade, but you will get a real, respectable handful of beans from a corner nobody believed could grow them. And there's a quiet joy in that. Reach for bush beans, not pole beans. They're compact, they don't need a tall trellis, and they get the job done in a small space. And number 18, the one that truly belongs in the dark, watercress. In the wild, watercress grows in the cold mud of shaded forest streams, so a dim, damp corner is its idea of paradise. Here's a wonderful trick for it, and one that's especially kind on the knees and the worry. Take a plastic container with no drainage holes at all, fill it with potting mix, and keep it sitting in water all the time. Put it in the deepest, darkest shadow you have. That standing water means you can't overwater it. The one thing we all fret about, and it asks almost nothing of you. Fresh, peppery greens from the gloomiest spot on the balcony. So there they are, 18 vegetables, and not one of them needs you to chase the sun. And now, as promised, that one watering habit, because it undoes more shade gardens than any pest ever will. Here it is. Because your pots aren't baking in the sun, the soil holds its moisture far longer than you're used to. And out of pure habit, most of us reach for the watering can every single day. In the shade, that drowns the roots. It suffocates them and invites rot. So do this instead. Push a finger into the soil, down about 2 inches. If it feels damp down there, step back and leave the plant be. Water only when it's beginning to dry. And here's the gift hidden in that. Less watering means fewer heavy cans to haul. Fewer trips, less bending, easier on the back and the knees. The shade garden, you see, ends up taking care of you, right back. Now that free trick I promised. You can pour more light onto a dark balcony without paying the power company a dime. The light is already there. It's just being swallowed by dark brick and gray concrete. So give it something to bounce off. Paint the wall behind your plants a flat, bright white, or stand a sheet of whiteboard behind the pots. The Old Farmer's Almanac has noted for years that a freshly whitened wall throws light right back onto the plants. You're simply gathering up the soft light that's already bouncing around and aiming it at your leaves. Cheap, quiet, and it costs nothing to run. You know, the little garden in your mind's eye, the dark corner you were almost ready to give up on, it reminds me of something. I spent years believing a garden lived and died by the sun, that without a wide, bright yard, there wasn't much point. It took me far too long to understand that the gardeners who fed their families through hard times, the ones with a few pots on a shaded stoop and a victory garden out back, they were never really feeding the plants at all. They were tending the soil beneath them, the patient, living way their own folks had taught them, and the soil gave it back. That dark corner of yours isn't a smaller version of the garden you had. It's the same craft, carried into a new season of life. The same hands, the same good soil, just closer to the kitchen door. So if that's the kind of gardening you come from, or the kind you'd like to grow into, you already belong here. Subscribe, and let's keep tending the old, honest way, together. Before you go, let's gather it all in one place. The salad greens, lettuce, spinach, arugula, and chard. The cooking greens, kale, collards, mustard, and bok choy. The living windowsill, parsley, cilantro, mint, chives, and green onions. The roots, radishes, beets, and carrots. And the 2 rule breakers, bush beans, and watercress in its little pool of water. 18 plants, 3 hours of soft light, and a few inches of soil you fed yourself. That dark corner was a garden all along. It was only ever waiting for the right list. Pick just one this weekend. A pot of loose-leaf lettuce by the door, maybe, or a little tray of watercress in the shadows. Set it out, and let it remind you that growth and patience and quiet beauty don't need the spotlight to thrive. Keep your hands in the soil, and I'll see you next time, here at Golden Harvest.